childcare advocates from across the country for quite some time. I want to, first of all, begin the assembly by thanking the Women and Gender Equality Canada for providing financial support to make this assembly happen, and also to have provided funding for Childcare Now for the last 3 years in the form of a capacity grant to strengthen our advocacy work across the country. It's we went many decades without any financial support from the federal government, where financial support from the federal government for advocacy work was prohibited. And so we really welcome the change in government and government policy that finally allowed some funding. Not enough, but we've used the money well. My name is Morna Ballantyne, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Executive Director of Childcare Now, the Childcare Advocacy Association of Canada. And we want to begin the assembly with a land acknowledgement, and I want to invite Shelley Bird, who lives in this area, who's the childcare coordinator for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and serves on the board of directors of Childcare Now, has been a longtime childcare advocate, to acknowledge the land in which we're meeting. Thank you.
Do you want me to do it from here? Childcare Now's office is located on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, but our organization is active on the lands and waters unceded and contested across Turtle Island. As a national advocacy organization, Childcare Now respects and affirms the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples with whom we strive to work in solidarity with. Childcare Now commits to the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action to address the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. We note in particular call number 12, which calls upon all of the early childhood education programs for Indigenous families across the country. Thank you.
So I want to speak briefly about the purpose of this assembly and a little bit about the agenda. So we convened this assembly out of a need and a desire to renew our childcare advocacy strategy. The last time we had a detailed, multi-day discussion around our advocacy strategy was in 2014 at the Childcare 2020 Policy Conference. And I'm just curious, raise your hands if you attended the Childcare 2020 conference. Yeah, terrific. And online, do we have hands being raised?
Not yet, but I know that some people who were there.
It's great that so many of you in the room were there. It's also really great that so many in the room were not there, because it's an indication of the growth and the change in the childcare advocacy movement over the last 10 years. When we held the conference in 2014, it was 1 year before the 2015 federal election. And we organized the conference and named it Childcare 2020 because we wanted to, prior to the federal election, affirm a common vision for the kind of early learning and childcare system that was needed for children, needed for educators who work in the programs, needed for the economy, and needed for gender equity as well, and equity more generally as well for all. And the idea of the 2020 conference was to try to build some consensus around some key policy demands, around creating a vision and then translating that vision into some key policy demands. And at the time, it was, a very different conference than the National Policy Conference that had taken place 10 years earlier. We were discussing issues that had not been addressed in any detail the 10 years prior. And, for example, there was a lot of tension around issues of inclusion, the inclusion of children with disabilities, but also the need to address the serious crisis in terms of access of childcare services for Indigenous peoples, by Indigenous peoples, developed by. And the conference affirmed our belief in the self-determination of the Métis Nation, the Inuit, and the First Nations to have the funds and resources, but also to determine for their own people what kind of childcare services would meet the needs of Indigenous families best. We came out of that conference with a good vision, but it was fairly general. We called for federal leadership. We said we would not be able to develop a kind of inclusive, affordable, accessible system without federal funding. Federal government has the greatest fiscal capacity. We needed that fiscal capacity to make it happen, and also to make sure that there would be equity within the borders of Canada in terms of access, that one's ability to get access to high-quality, inclusive childcare should not depend on your postal code. And so that, and that the federal government can play a role to make sure that that didn't happen. So we called for a lot of federal money. We called for federal leadership, and we called for a number of other policy measures at different levels of government and at the program level that needed to be implemented. But generally speaking, it was general. We wanted a universal program. We wanted it to be high quality. We wanted it to be affordable. We wanted more money. We wanted the federal government to step up. And through 2014 and beyond, we worked very hard to get the federal government to take leadership. 2015, we had a change of government. We knew that was the first step. They had a change of government in 2015, and we were successful in getting that. And when the Justin Trudeau government took office in 2015, their commitment to childcare was fairly broad. In their first budget, there was almost no money. I think it was $500,000, from what I remember, $500,000 for early learning and childcare in 2016. The Trudeau government took office and proudly proclaimed itself as a feminist organization, and I think they were really taken aback. And I know this to be the case. Prime Minister Trudeau was very taken aback by the lack of positive reception on the part of feminist organizations in 2016. And feminist organization after feminist organization said you can't call yourself feminist if you don't have a budget that provides early learning and childcare. And so that was a bit of a shock. 2017, they did a bit better. At least there was a commitment to 10-year funding, multi-year funding. But overall, it was an inadequate commitment. It went up each year over the 10 years, but over the 10-year period, it was, remind me, 10 billion over 10 years, right? Am I getting that 10 million? Sorry, no, I think it was 10 million. Anyway, we weren't even talking billions. So there was some policy work that started to happen at the federal level, but really, as we know, COVID changed everything in 2020, and I'm not going to go through all the reasons for that, but one of the big things that changed was the federal government and other government and the public attitude towards public spending. All of a sudden, people realized it's possible to mobilize fiscal capacity to meet the needs, urgent needs of the people, and that it was necessary not just to make sure that individual families and others, didn't suffer huge economic stress as the economy was collapsing, but those kinds of public investments were needed to actually keep the economy going. And the general consensus of economists is this was a really good move, and that Canada did better than a lot of other Western capitalist economies. So 2021, the federal budget comes down, and we had some inkling that there was going to be more money for early learning and childcare than had been allocated in 2017 in the economic statement, if you recall, that preceded the 2021 federal budget. But the 21 federal budget, I have to say, surprised even me and I think other advocates, that a commitment over 5 years of, $30 billion was pretty amazing. Now, because we had already been talking about billions through 2021, it sort of seemed easier to roll off, People wouldn't confuse millions and billions anymore. It was actually billions, and that didn't sound, like we'd misread the number of zeros. But so huge achievement. But then the challenge was, how do you take this money and build the system that we want? The budget made some really serious and important policy commitments. It speaks about making early learning and childcare available, accessible to all. It didn't use the term universal, but effectively it advanced a vision of a universal program. Knowing that the federal government doesn't actually operate programs and actually doesn't regulate programs, and that the money had to be administered through the provinces and the territorial governments, they got to work negotiating funding agreements, and I think we can really congratulate the federal government for having achieved funding agreements with 13 jurisdictions in a year's time. It was incredible. And again, a demonstration of what can be done when you have enough money on the table. And when you have political will, resources can be mobilized. This situation has become incredibly complicated. And we have had to move our advocacy from making broad demands to being able to answer some very specific questions about how it's going to happen. Specific questions like, how should educators, registered early childhood educators, other early childhood educators, other who work in it, how should they be paid? Who should determine what the pay level should be? How should the services be funded? With the fee reductions, we're moving into an extraordinary situation that I have to say I didn't think would ever occurred so quickly, is that we're moving to a licensed childcare system regulated as almost totally publicly funded. But when you put limits on parent fees, and when you say the funding is only going to come from the public purse, then it becomes even more important to make sure that the public funding is adequate to provide the services that we need, and we're not there yet. We have a workforce crisis that needs urgent attention. We have an availability, a supply crisis that needs urgent attention. When you have a publicly funded system of services, they're almost, we're paid for, legitimate questions get raised by those who don't have access. Why is it that I cannot find a space that is affordable because the spaces are so limited? And why does that family get a space and not me? Or why does that community get a space but not our community? And why is that population underserved, whereas this population is much better served? These are the kinds of situations that spawn division. And I'm afraid we're at the point that if they're not addressed in an urgent way by government before the next federal election, the whole project is at risk of being eliminated by some future government. So this assembly is about figuring out what do we have to do as advocates to continue to support the Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare, to advocate how do we think it needs to be strengthened, what do we think can be reasonably done within the next 2 years so that we can defend proudly the work that has been done, and we can say we support the system, we want it to be better, it's a good system, it needs improvement, it will take a while to build to the point that we need to be. That's what this assembly is about. So there's an urgency, and I also just want to say the agenda is about that, reflects that. And I also want to say something else about the agenda. The agenda is really developed and has been organized around, let me call it a theory of change. And I want to be transparent about this. The theory of change is that we're actually not going to get the change unless we're unified. We are not going to get the change unless we put forward common demands. We are not going to get the change through only back rooms. We are going to have to bring about the change by mobilizing, by organizing, and by engaging and broadening our movement to even greater numbers, to greater numbers than we've ever had before, and to mobilize that now through the election and beyond the election. So the agenda talks about all these things. What should our strategic policy demands be? How are we going to get them? How do we have to organize ourselves internally as a movement? What do we have to do to broaden the movement? And let's leave with at least some answers. The work will obviously continue beyond the Assembly. Childcare Now is committed to continue to convene and facilitate this work, but not alone. We have many, many allied organizations. We are becoming a diverse movement, need to be more diverse. That's a task for all of us. So have a great 2 days. I'm just going to end it there, I think. And I just want to say a few things. Kathy introduced herself as the facilitator. Kathy, thank you so much for taking this on. Kathy Ramis and I have worked for decades, I would say,